I can still recall the day I first saw it, as if etched into my memory with a burning iron. The sky was heavy with the weight of an impending storm. Clouds smudged across the horizon in shades of bruised purple and gray. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as I drove down the rutted dirt road leading to the town's flea market. It wasn't a trip I made often, too far, too busy, but that day, desperation had pushed me out the door. The farm was falling apart. Not in the way that happens slowly over time, but in the way that feels deliberate, almost malicious. Birds had become an infestation, swooping in like black clouds to strip the fields bare. Rodents scurried through the soil, gnawing at roots, leaving only husks behind. Even the insects seemed to buzz louder, their relentless assault a symphony of destruction. I'd tried everything: traps, sprays, new fencing. Nothing worked. Every morning the damage was worse, and I could feel the land slipping through my fingers like sand in an hourglass. Lila, my wife, tried to keep her chin up for the kids, but I could see the strain in her every movement. She'd always been the strong one, the glue holding us together, but even she was cracking under the pressure. Her smiles were forced now, her laughter a distant memory. And the kids, they were too young to understand, but they felt the tension. Little Emma had stopped asking why we couldn't afford ice cream on Sundays. Ben, my eldest, barely spoke anymore, retreating into his room with a silence that cut deeper than any argument. That's why I found myself at the flea market that day, wandering through its labyrinth of stalls with no clear plan, just a desperate hope that something, anything, might help. Rusty, our loyal old retriever, trotted beside me, his golden fur dusty from the dry heat. His tail wagged half-heartedly, as if even he could sense the weight pressing down on me. I passed tables cluttered with mismatched dishes, rusty tools, and faded books, my frustration growing with every step. What was I even looking for? A miracle? A solution? I didn't know. And then, I saw it. It was tucked in the farthest corner of the market, leaning against a pile of broken furniture like an afterthought. A scarecrow, but not the kind you'd expect to see. Cheerful, with a painted face and a straw hat. No, this one was wrong. Its burlap face was mottled and torn, the stitching pulling apart at the seams. Its clothes hung in tatters, sagging over a skeletal frame of weathered wood. The eyes were what caught me, though, two dark voids that seemed to drink in the light around them. And the smile, it was stitched wide, unnaturally so, as if mocking some unseen joke. Rusty stopped in his tracks, his ears pinning back as he let out a low growl. I hesitated, a shiver crawling up my spine, but I couldn't look away. Looking for something to keep the pests off your crops? The voice made me jump. I turned to see an old man standing behind the stall, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. His skin was like cracked leather, his eyes small and sharp, like a bird's. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely audible. "How did you—" He didn't let me finish. "This'll do it," he said, gesturing toward the scarecrow with a gnarled hand. "Best you'll ever find." I wanted to ask how a scarecrow, especially one so dilapidated, could possibly help, but the words stuck in my throat. There was something in his gaze, a weight that made me feel like a child being scolded. Instead, I asked, "How much?" He named a price that was almost laughably low. For a moment, I wondered if this was some kind of scam, but desperation won out. I handed over the money and loaded the scarecrow into the truck bed, its limp body thudding against the metal as I climbed into the cab. Rusty jumped in beside me, still growling softly as we pulled away. By the time I got home, the sun was sinking below the horizon, casting the fields in a dusky orange glow. Lila was inside, the warm light of the kitchen spilling out through the windows as the kids helped her set the table. For a brief moment, the sight filled me with a bittersweet ache, a reminder of what we were fighting so hard to preserve. I hauled the scarecrow into the field, choosing a spot dead center where it would be most visible. The ground was hard, cracked from the relentless heat, and the air was heavy with the scent of dry earth. I secured the scarecrow to an old wooden post, its crooked frame swaying slightly in the breeze. As I stepped back to admire my work, a strange sensation prickled at the back of my neck. It felt like I was being watched. Rusty barked sharply, snapping me out of my thoughts. I glanced at him, then back at the scarecrow. Its hollow eyes seemed to glint in the fading light, and for a moment I could have sworn its head tilted slightly. I shook my head, muttering under my breath, "You're losing it, Patrick." That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark, empty sockets staring back at me. The wind howled outside, carrying with it a faint rustling that I couldn't quite place. I told myself it was just the crops, but deep down, I wasn't sure. The next morning I stepped outside, bracing myself for the usual devastation. But when I reached the fields, I stopped dead in my tracks. The crops were untouched. Not a single stalk was broken, not a single leaf nibbled. It was as if the Scarecrow had worked its magic overnight. Relief flooded through me, mingled with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. The pests were gone, the fields were thriving, and for the first time in months I felt a glimmer of hope. Even Lila noticed the change, her tension easing as she watched the kids play in the yard. But then, the silence began. It started subtly. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness that seemed to hang over the farm. Rusty refused to go near the field, whining and pawing at the ground whenever I tried to coax him closer. And at night, I began to hear things. Soft, shuffling sounds like footsteps moving through the rows of corn. It happened on the fourth night. I was jolted awake by a loud, frantic barking. Rusty was at the door, his fur bristling, his eyes wild. I grabbed a flashlight and threw on my boots, my heart pounding as I stepped outside. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, and I saw them. Dead animals scattered across the field. Birds, rabbits, even a stray cat. Their bodies were twisted, contorted as if something had toyed with them before finishing the job. Straw was scattered everywhere, and in the center of the carnage stood the Scarecrow, its crooked smile wide and triumphant. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't natural, this wasn't right, but I couldn't bring myself to move it. Something about the way it stood there, almost alive, made my skin crawl. The following days passed in a haze of fear and denial. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, that there was a rational explanation. But deep down, I knew better. And then, one night I saw it move. I was watching from the upstairs window, unable to sleep when the Scarecrow began to drift through the field. It didn't walk. It floated, its wooden frame swaying as if carried by an unseen force. And behind it, I saw them. Emma and Ben, my children. Their eyes were wide and blank, their movements stiff and mechanical as they followed the Scarecrow through the rows of corn. My breath caught in my throat. I bolted downstairs, grabbing my shotgun as I tore through the field. "Emma! Ben!" I shouted, my voice raw with panic. They didn't respond. They didn't even look at me. I reached them just as the Scarecrow stopped. Its hollow eyes seemed to glow in the moonlight, and for a moment, I felt a cold, unrelenting hatred radiating from it. Without thinking, I raised the shotgun and fired. The Scarecrow exploded in a burst of straw and fabric, the wooden frame collapsing in on itself. Emma and Ben blinked, their eyes clearing as they looked around in confusion. "Daddy?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. I pulled them into my arms, holding them tightly as tears streamed down my face. The Scarecrow was gone, but the memory of its empty smile lingered, a shadow that would haunt me forever. The farm recovered, the crops thrived, and for the first time in years we were able to pay off our debts. But the cost was high. Emma and Ben suffered from relentless nightmares, and even Lila, who never knew the full story, sensed the darkness that had lingered over our farm like a storm cloud. She asked me about the Scarecrow once, after noticing its absence in the field. I told her I had burned it, that it was too old and falling apart to be of any use. She accepted my answer with a quiet nod, but I could see the doubt flickering in her eyes. Emma and Ben were never the same after that night. Emma stopped playing outside, her laughter replaced by a quiet, distant demeanor. She would draw strange, jagged shapes in her notebooks, circles within circles, spirals, and patterns that made my stomach twist. Ben, on the other hand, became terrified of the dark, insisting on sleeping with the lights on and the door wide open. Every creak of the old farmhouse sent him into a panic, and he'd cry out for me, his voice trembling with fear. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That the Scarecrow, or whatever force had animated it, wasn't truly gone. Some nights I'd wake in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear faint rustling outside my window. I'd peer out into the darkness, my heart pounding. But the field would always be still, the crops swaying gently in the breeze. But then the dreams started. They began as vague, disjointed fragments. Images of the Scarecrow's hollow eyes, its stitched smile stretching impossibly wide. Over time, they grew more vivid, more visceral. I'd dream of the field bathed in blood-red moonlight, the Scarecrow standing tall and unbroken, its arms outstretched as if inviting me closer. In these dreams I could hear whispers, low and guttural, speaking words I didn't understand, but felt deep in my bones. One night, I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The whispers from my dream seemed to linger in the air, faint but unmistakable. I sat up, my pulse racing, and listened. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the direction of the field. Grabbing my flashlight, I crept downstairs, careful not to wake Lila or the kids. Rusty's old leash still hung by the door, a painful reminder of our loyal dog who had given his life protecting us. I stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin as I made my way toward the field. The crops were tall and dense, their shadows stretching like skeletal fingers under the pale moonlight. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the night itself was holding its breath. The shuffling grew louder as I pushed deeper into the field, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. And then, I saw it. In the very spot where I had burned the Scarecrow, something was growing. At first I thought it was a plant, a cluster of tall, spindly stalks that seemed to writhe in the faint breeze. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't plants at all. They were fingers. Long, skeletal fingers, sprouting from the ground like grotesque weeds. The sight made my stomach churn, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around me like a suffocating fog. "Leave," they hissed. "This is not your place." I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest as I tore through the rows of corn, the whispers chasing me like a predator. By the time I reached the house, I was shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I leaned against it. The next morning I went back to the field, hoping, praying that what I had seen was just another nightmare. But the ground where the Scarecrow had stood was bare, the soil undisturbed. There was no sign of the fingers, no trace of the whispers that had haunted me. But I knew better. I could feel it, deep in my gut. The Scarecrow wasn't gone. It had never been gone. Whatever it was, whatever dark force had taken hold of our farm, it was still there, waiting. I didn't tell Lila. I couldn't. She was already carrying so much, and I didn't want to add to her burden. Instead, I threw myself into the farm, working from dawn until dusk, trying to drown out the growing unease with exhaustion. But no matter how hard I worked, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. A week later, it happened again. It was a moonless night, the darkness thick and impenetrable. I was sitting by the window, unable to sleep, when I saw movement in the field. At first, I thought it was an animal, a fox or a stray dog. But as I squinted into the shadows, I realized it was something else entirely. The Scarecrow was back. It stood in the center of the field, its arms outstretched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The stitched smile seemed wider now, more sinister, and its hollow eyes glinted faintly in the darkness. My blood ran cold. How was this possible? I had destroyed it. I had burned it to ash. And yet, here it was, as if it had never left. I grabbed my shotgun and stepped outside, my hands trembling as I approached the field. The air was deathly still, the usual night sounds eerily absent. As I got closer, the Scarecrow seemed to grow taller, its presence more menacing. "Stay back," I warned, my voice cracking as I aimed the shotgun. But it didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I pulled the trigger, the blast echoing through the night. The Scarecrow's body jerked, straw and fabric flying into the air. But when the smoke cleared, it was still standing, completely unscathed. Panic set in as I fired again and again, each shot having no effect. The Scarecrow's smile seemed to widen, its hollow eyes burning into me. And then, it moved. It didn't walk or float this time. It lunged. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. I turned and ran, my legs barely carrying me as I sprinted back to the house. Slamming the door shut behind me, I locked it and braced myself against it, my chest heaving with every breath. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room with their sinister chant. "This is our place. You cannot stay." The lights flickered, and I heard footsteps upstairs, soft, deliberate, heading toward the kids' rooms. My heart sank as I realized the Scarecrow wasn't after me. It was after my family. I grabbed a lantern and a can of gasoline from the shed, my hand shaking as I doused the Scarecrow's original post in fuel. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, but I didn't stop. Striking a match, I set the post ablaze, the flames roaring to life as the whispers turned into a deafening scream. The Scarecrow appeared at the edge of the field, its body contorting as it tried to move closer. But the fire held it back, the flames creating a barrier it couldn't cross. With every ounce of strength I had, I threw the lantern at the Scarecrow, the glass shattering as it exploded in a burst of fire. The Scarecrow writhed and twisted, its body consumed by the flames. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The field was silent once more, the whispers fading into nothingness. I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. But as I looked up at the house, I saw them. Emma and Ben standing in the window, their faces pale and blank, their eyes glinting faintly in the moonlight. The Scarecrow was gone, but its shadow remained. And I knew, deep down, that it would never truly leave us. The first time I heard it, I thought it was the wind rattling the old siding. It was past midnight, the kind of quiet where every creak of the house feels amplified. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too tired to move but not tired enough to sleep. That's when the sound started, soft, deliberate scratching, like tiny claws scraping against wood. It came from the wall just behind my headboard. I froze, listening, my breath caught in my throat. Mice, I told myself. Or maybe tree branches brushing against the house. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, right there in the wall. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. Relieved, I laughed at myself for being so jumpy. This old house had plenty of quirks. I'd just moved in 2 weeks ago and wasn't used to them yet. I figured I'd set some traps in the morning and went back to scrolling on my phone. But then it started again, louder this time. The scratching seemed to move, dragging its way along the wall. I sat up, heart pounding, and stared at the darkened corner of the room. That's when I heard it, just beneath the scratching. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It sounded like my name. The scratching didn't stop after that first night. In fact, it got worse. It became my nightly companion, always starting just as the rest of the world went to sleep. It wasn't just in one spot anymore. Some nights it came from the far corner of the living room. Other nights, it sounded like it was crawling its way down the hallway, always just out of reach. The more I tried to pinpoint its location, the more it seemed to evade me, as if it knew I was listening. I tried to investigate, of course. I scoured every inch of the house the next morning, checking for holes or gaps where animals might have snuck in. I climbed into the attic, flashlight in hand, and swept through the basement with a growing sense of unease. But there was nothing. No nests, no droppings, not even a hint of claw marks. Whatever was making the noise wasn't leaving any physical evidence behind. As the days turned into weeks, I started to feel it even during the day, a creeping sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to catch someone standing in the doorway, but I was always alone. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement, just a shadow flickering across the room. But when I turned to look, nothing was there. When I mentioned it to a neighbor one afternoon, hoping for some practical advice, they grew uncharacteristically quiet. "You live in that house?" they asked, eyes narrowing. I nodded, confused by the sudden shift in their demeanor. "Didn't the previous owner tell you? They left in a hurry and said they couldn't deal with the noises anymore." "What kind of noises?" I pressed. "Scratching. Like something trying to get out." The words sent a chill racing down my spine. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but their words stayed with me. That night, the scratching started earlier than usual. As I sat in the dim light of the living room, I swore I heard something new, a faint whisper buried beneath the sound. It didn't make sense, not really, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was calling to me. Just your imagination, I muttered to myself, but my voice felt small in the empty room. That night, the scratching was louder than ever. It wasn't just a faint sound in the distance. It was right there, behind the wall in the living room, relentless and almost rhythmic. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the wall where the noise seemed loudest, the beam of light trembling in my hand. My breath came in shallow bursts as I pressed my ear against the cold surface, listening for any clue of what might be inside. And then I saw them. Two small, glowing eyes stared back at me from a crack near the baseboard. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a raccoon or maybe a stray cat that had somehow found its way inside the walls. But there was something unsettling about the way the eyes looked. They weren't darting around like an animal's might. They were steady, unblinking, and far too human in their shape and intensity. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, the beam casting eerie, shifting shadows across the room. My heart raced as I scrambled to my feet, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But those eyes, I couldn't unsee them. They were too vivid, too real. The next morning, I called an exterminator, describing the sounds and the strange sight. The man arrived later that afternoon with his tools, a confident grin plastered on his face. "Probably just a squirrel or maybe some birds," he said as he set to work inspecting the walls. I hovered nearby, desperate for answers but dreading what he might find. After what felt like hours, he turned to me, wiping his hands on a rag. "There's nothing in there," he said with a shrug. "No nests, no droppings, no sign of any animals at all. You sure you weren't just hearing the pipes or something?" I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes. Still, I nodded and thanked him, hoping the reassurance would be enough to quiet my growing unease. But it wasn't. I told a friend about it the next day, laughing nervously as I recounted the events, trying to make it sound like a joke. She listened patiently, her face unreadable, before finally saying, "You've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe you're just seeing things. It happens, when you're tired." Her words stung, but I didn't argue. Maybe she was right. Maybe the sleepless nights and constant anxiety were playing tricks on my mind, but deep down I knew what I had seen. And it wasn't just my imagination. The scratching continued, and so did the sightings. I started seeing the eyes more often, not just at night, but sometimes in the middle of the day. They would appear in different places: a gap in the kitchen cabinets, a crack in the hallway ceiling, even the tiny space between the window frame and the wall. Always watching, always unblinking. I began avoiding the walls altogether, sticking to the center of the rooms as much as possible. But the sense of being watched followed me everywhere. Even when the eyes weren't visible, I could feel them, an invisible weight pressing down on me, making it impossible to relax. One evening, I decided to confront whatever was happening head-on. Armed with a crowbar, I pried open a section of the wall where I had seen the eyes most frequently. The plaster crumbled away, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. My flashlight beam pierced the shadows, illuminating dust and cobwebs, but nothing else. No animals, no signs of life. And yet, as I stared into the void, I felt it again, that unshakable sense of being watched. I couldn't shake the unease, so I decided to dig deeper into the house's past. If I was going to live here, I needed to know what I was dealing with. After all, every home has a story, and this one seemed to be telling its tale in ways that defied logic. The next morning, I drove to the town library. It was a quiet, unassuming building with a bell above the door that jingled softly as I stepped inside. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with a kind face, greeted me warmly, though her expression shifted when I mentioned the address of my house. "Ah, the old Martin place," she said, her voice lowering as if we were sharing a secret. "That house has been around for ages. What are you looking for?" "Just history," I said vaguely, not wanting to sound ridiculous by mentioning the eyes or the noises. "Anything about the previous owners or events tied to it." She nodded and led me to the archives, a room that smelled faintly of mildew and dust. She pointed me toward a set of old newspapers and property records, then left me to my search. As I sifted through the yellowed pages, a pattern began to emerge. Stories of misfortune, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of something unnatural. The most chilling discovery was an article from the 1950s about a family who had lived in the house. The youngest child, a boy named Thomas, had vanished without a trace. His parents claimed he was playing in the living room one moment and gone the next. The police found no signs of forced entry or evidence of foul play, but the family moved away soon after, leaving the house vacant for years. Another clipping, this one from the 1970s, detailed the tragic story of an elderly recluse who was found dead in the same house. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises for weeks before his body was discovered. The autopsy revealed he had starved to death, despite food being plentiful in his kitchen. The article quoted a neighbor who swore she saw him staring out of the windows at night, though the house had been empty for days. The further back I went, the darker the stories became. One account spoke of a murder-suicide in the late 1800s, the original owner killing his wife and 2 children before turning the gun on himself. But even more unsettling was a recurring rumor whispered in almost every article: something in the walls. The descriptions were vague. Scratching, fleeting shadows, voices that mimicked family members. I closed the last folder and leaned back in my chair, my head spinning. It felt like the house had been cursed, its history soaked in misery and fear. I thanked the librarian and drove home, my stomach churning as the house came into view. It looked so normal from the outside, its white siding and flower-lined porch deceptively inviting. That night the scratching returned, but it wasn't alone. This time there were whispers, faint and indistinct, like a radio tuned to a dead station, but undeniably there. They seemed to come from every corner of the house, a low, murmuring hum that grew louder when I turned off the lights. I strained to make out the words, but they were just out of reach, teasing my ears with half-formed syllables. Desperate for answers, I grabbed my flashlight and began searching again. This time, I wasn't looking for animals or logical explanations. I was looking for proof of the house's past, something that might explain what was happening. In the crawl space beneath the stairs, I found it. A small wooden box, buried beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. Its hinges were rusted and the wood felt brittle under my fingers as I pried it open. Inside were items that sent a chill racing down my spine. A tiny faded shoe, a yellowed photograph of a young boy smiling shyly at the camera, and a handful of marbles. These weren't just forgotten belongings. They were relics of a child's life. Thomas, the boy who had disappeared. As I held the photograph up to the light, I felt it again, that unshakable sense of being watched. Slowly, I turned my head toward the wall, and there they were, the eyes, staring at me from a crack just above the baseboard, unblinking and impossibly still. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic, and for the first time I could make out a single word repeated over and over. "Help!" I stumbled back, clutching the photograph as the whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from pleading to something darker, something accusatory. My breath caught in my throat and my flashlight wavered as I aimed it toward the wall. The crack where the eyes had been was now empty, but the weight of their gaze lingered, pressing down on me like an invisible hand. I scrambled out of the crawl space, the photograph clutched tightly in my trembling hand. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what I'd just experienced. It wasn't just a noise or a trick of the light. Something was in this house, something that defied explanation. I needed answers, but more than that, I needed to get out. My legs felt heavy as I climbed the stairs, each step creaking underfoot as if the house itself was protesting my movements. As I reached the top of the stairs, a low thud echoed from the living room below. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone pounding a fist against the walls. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, and turned back to shine the flashlight into the darkness. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving behind an oppressive silence that was almost worse. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move, caught in a paralyzing mix of fear and curiosity. Gathering every ounce of courage, I descended the stairs, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick shadows. The living room was empty, but the air was colder here, sharp and biting against my skin. The thudding sound resumed, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from the floor. I hesitated, staring down at the worn wooden planks beneath my feet. Slowly, I crouched and pressed my ear to the ground. What I heard chilled me to my core. A faint, ragged breathing, as if someone were trapped just beneath the floorboards. It was slow and labored, each exhale filled with a wet, gurgling sound that made my stomach churn. I yanked myself upright, my pulse racing, and backed away toward the front door. I didn't care about answers anymore. Whatever was happening here was beyond me, beyond reason. I needed to leave. But as I reached for the doorknob, the whispers started again. They filled the room, circling me, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. The temperature plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs as I turned to face the living room. The furniture was shifting, chairs scraping against the floor, the coffee table sliding inches to the left, as if some unseen force was rearranging the space. The photograph in my hand burned hot against my skin, and I dropped it instinctively. As it fluttered to the ground, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against my ears like a physical weight. The photograph landed face up, and I could swear the boy's expression had changed. His once shy smile was now twisted into a grimace, his eyes wide with terror. I backed away, my foot catching on the edge of the rug. I stumbled but caught myself on the doorframe, gripping it tightly as I tried to steady my breathing. Then the thudding started again, this time from the walls. It was everywhere, a relentless pounding that seemed to echo in my skull. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block out the noise. "Leave," a voice roared, low and guttural, cutting through the cacophony like a blade. It came from all around me, yet nowhere at the same time, reverberating through the very foundation of the house. I didn't need to be told twice. I wrenched the door open and stumbled outside, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook uncontrollably. As I sped down the driveway, the house loomed in my rearview mirror, its windows glowing faintly with an unnatural light. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me leave, their gaze burning into the back of my neck. It wasn't until I was miles away, the house a distant memory, that the whispers finally stopped. But the silence they left behind was far from comforting. I stumbled into the yard, gulping the crisp night air as I tried to steady my shaking legs. My car was in sight, but something rooted me to the spot. It wasn't just fear, it was the unanswered question gnawing at my mind. What was in those walls? I could feel its presence like a dark shadow creeping behind me. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination, and I couldn't let it remain hidden. Something had to be done. With a deep breath, I turned back toward the house. My flashlight flickered, the weak beam barely illuminating the overgrown lawn leading to the porch. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the house itself was resisting my return. The thudding noise started again, faint and deliberate, as if mocking my decision to come back. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I pushed forward, gripping the flashlight tighter as I crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was stifling, heavy with the smell of damp wood and decay. The whispers were back, weaving through the darkness, faint and fragmented. I made my way to the wall where I'd seen the eyes. The plaster was cracked, barely holding together, and the faint outline of an opening was now unmistakable. My hands trembled as I reached for the loose paneling, prying it free with a loud groan of wood. Behind the wall was a narrow space, dark and suffocating. The smell hit me first, a rancid, putrid stench that turned my stomach. I gagged, holding my sleeve to my nose as I shone the flashlight inside. At first, all I saw were shadows, tangled wires, and broken beams. But then something moved, subtle yet deliberate, drawing my eyes to the far corner. It was hunched, barely discernible against the backdrop of debris. The creature, or whatever it was, looked human at first glance, but only just. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over sharp, angular bones. It was unnervingly thin, its arms unnaturally long with fingers that ended in sharp, blackened nails. The hollow eyes I'd seen earlier were now fully visible, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like a predator's gaze in the dark. For a moment, we stared at each other. Its lips parted, revealing jagged, uneven teeth as it let out a low, guttural growl. My blood turned to ice as it began to move, slow and deliberate, dragging its twisted limbs forward. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. Darkness swallowed the room, but I could hear it, its ragged breathing, its nails scraping against the wood as it advanced. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and ran. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar, voices screaming unintelligible words that seemed to echo inside my head. The creature was fast, its movements erratic and animalistic as it chased me through the house. I darted into the kitchen, grabbing the first thing I could find, a cast-iron skillet, and turned to face it. It lunged at me, its long arms reaching out, nails slashing through the air. I swung the skillet with all my strength, the impact sending a sickening crack through the room. The creature reeled back, a guttural screech escaping its lips as it staggered. But it didn't stop. It recovered quickly, its hollow eyes locked onto me with a burning intensity. Desperate, I grabbed a box of matches from the counter and a can of lighter fluid I'd left near the back door. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lid, dousing the creature with the pungent liquid as it advanced. Its growls grew louder, more feral, and I could feel the heat of its breath as it closed the distance. With a spark, the match ignited, and I flung it at the creature. Flames erupted, consuming it in a burst of orange and red. Its screams were unlike anything I'd ever heard, high-pitched and otherworldly, echoing through the house as it writhed in agony. The fire spread quickly, licking at the walls and ceiling as smoke filled the air. Coughing and choking, I stumbled out of the house, collapsing onto the lawn as the flames consumed everything behind me. The creature's screams faded into the crackling of the fire, and I watched as the house, the source of my nightmares, was reduced to ash. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I sat in the yard, soot-streaked and exhausted. The whispers were gone, the thudding silenced, but the scars they left behind would never fully heal. I glanced at the charred remains of the house, a bittersweet sense of relief washing over me. It was over, or so I hoped. The sun was rising, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink as I sat on the damp grass, staring at the smoldering remains of the house. The fire had devoured everything, the walls, the shadows, and the secrets they held. But the quiet that followed wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that came with an unspoken question. Was it truly over? The acrid smell of smoke clung to me, and my hands still trembled as I traced the cuts and bruises on my arms. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was finished, that whatever had haunted those walls was gone for good. But deep down, doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The creature's hollow eyes flashed in my memory, its movements, its rage. It had been too real to simply vanish with the flames. I stood slowly, every muscle in my body aching, and turned to look at the field that bordered the property. A cool breeze swept through the grass, bending the tall blades as if they whispered to one another. For a fleeting moment I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement in the distance, just beyond the charred boundary of the house. I blinked, and it was gone. Pulling my jacket tighter around me, I walked toward my car, my shadow stretching long behind me in the morning light. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see something standing there, watching. The road stretched out ahead, and I told myself I wouldn't look back again. Whatever it was, it belonged to the ashes now. Or at least that's what I had to believe.